In 2026, Mercury goes retrograde 3 times. That's normal. It does that every year. 3 times, roughly 4 months apart. Standard stuff. But this year, all 3 of them are in water signs. Mercury retrograde in Pisces, then Cancer, then Scorpio. 3 for 3 in the emotional, intuitive, feeling first signs. No fire, no earth, no air. Just water, the whole year through. Now that doesn't happen constantly. The last time every Mercury retrograde fell in water signs was over a decade ago. And it's worth sitting with because it tells you something about what the next 12 months are actually asking of you. Not just this retrograde, but the whole year. The theme isn't confusion in the usual Mercury retrograde sense, the missed emails and the tech glitches, and the flights you shouldn't have booked. The theme is something deeper than that. It's about what you feel versus what you say. What you actually know internally versus what you've been presenting externally. What the emotional undercurrent has been trying to tell you while the surface level stuff kept you busy. And then the first of those 3 retrogrades happens to land here, right now. February 25th, 10:48 p.m. Pacific Time, at 22 degrees and 33 minutes of Pisces. Mercury stops moving forward and begins its slow walk backward through the sign that, honestly, is not Mercury's most natural territory. Pisces is water, intuition, the unnameable, the felt before known. Mercury wants to name everything. And in Pisces, it keeps running into things that won't cooperate with that impulse. So when Mercury stations retrograde in Pisces, it's less like a traffic jam and more like someone pressing the pause button on your internal dialogue so something deeper can be heard. Now, pair that with the week we've just had. The Saturn-Neptune conjunction at 0 degrees Aries on February 20th. The Venus-Jupiter trine. The first quarter moon. Mercury barely moving for days already, creeping toward this station. This week has been a lot. And now the week ends with Mercury officially turning around, the moon going void in Gemini after 5:59 p.m., and everything getting a little quieter in a particular way that feels either deeply peaceful or a little disorienting depending on your relationship with stillness. Before we get into all of it, leave a like and subscribe if you've been following this week's astrology. And drop water yeah in the comments because I genuinely want to know who's already feeling what this retrograde is about. Okay, let's actually talk about what's happening here. I am starting a new segment from this video. Towards the end of the video, I am doing a personal reading. To participate in this, you have to leave in the comments your birthday, time of birth, and place of birth. I will pick a comment randomly. I will do this 2-3 times a week. For today, this is the account. Here's something people don't talk about enough when Mercury retrograde season rolls around. They talk about what retrograde means. They talk about backing up your devices and not signing contracts, which, fine, that's all real. But they don't always talk about where Mercury actually is when it goes retrograde and what that sign does to the whole experience. Mercury in Pisces is what traditional astrologers call Mercury in its fall. That's a technical term that essentially means the planet is not operating in comfortable conditions. It doesn't mean it's broken. It means it has to work harder, navigate around more obstacles, find different ways of achieving what it's trying to do. Mercury's whole thing is precision, clarity, the ability to identify something, name it accurately, communicate it cleanly, move on to the next thing. That's what Mercury does when it's in signs that suit it. Gemini, Virgo, even Aquarius. It's efficient. It's quick. It cuts through. Pisces doesn't let any of that happen easily. Pisces operates in impressions, not definitions. In feelings that you can't quite put into words, but that you know are real. In that thing where you pick up a vibe about a situation before you have any logical reason to have that vibe, and then 3 weeks later, you find out you were completely right. Pisces does not hand you data points, it hands you atmosphere. And Mercury, arriving in that atmosphere, keeps trying to find the edges of things, and Pisces keeps dissolving the edges. So retrograde Mercury in Pisces is Mercury trying to go backward through fog. And the strange thing, The thing that actually makes this retrograde worth your attention rather than just your anxiety is that going backward through fog sometimes reveals things that the forward momentum was moving too fast to catch. The things you sensed but didn't stop to examine. The feelings you filed under. I'll deal with that later. The conversations you had that carried subtext you didn't fully register at the time. Mercury retrograde in Pisces has this quality of retrieval. You get back things that weren't ready to surface until now. Dreams become more vivid. Old memories return, not randomly but with a kind of pointed relevance, like they're applying for reconsideration. People from your past surface either in your thoughts or in actual reality. Things you said or heard weeks ago replay with different emphasis. You hear the part you missed the first time. And the reason this retrograde is landing the way it is right now, at the end of this particular week, is that everything Saturn and Neptune stirred up 5 days ago at their conjunction, all those questions about what's actually real in your life versus what you've been constructing around a hopeful story, Mercury retrograde in Pisces is going to walk you back through all of that, slowly, carefully, in its own non-linear Piscean way. Not to confuse you, though it might feel like that sometimes, but to make sure, actually understand what happened before you move on from it. Something shifts tonight around 5:59 p.m. Eastern because the moon goes void, of course, in Gemini. It stays void until it enters Cancer tomorrow. And a void moon in Gemini at the same time Mercury stations retrograde has a very specific quality that's worth understanding. The Gemini moon has been active all day. Gemini moons are chatty, quick, mentally busy, a little scattered in an energizing way. They want to make connections, exchange ideas, send that message they've been composing in their head. And today's Gemini moon has had an interesting charge to it because it was trine Pluto in Aquarius overnight, which added some depth to all that Gemini surface energy. The kind of day where the small talk kept turning into something more real without you quite planning for it. But when the moon goes void at 5:59 p.m., that changes. A void moon is essentially a moon that has completed its last major aspect in the current sign and is now in a kind of in-between state, traveling through the final degrees without making significant contact. Astrologers have written for centuries about the void moon as a time when things initiated don't tend to develop normally, when the usual productive momentum of daily life goes quiet. In Gemini, a void moon quiets the part of you that wants to process everything through language and exchange. The mental loop that's been running all week, the part that's been trying to make sense of this month's astrology by talking about it, thinking about it, reaching out to people about it, that loop goes quieter. And what fills the space is something more internal. Then, when the moon moves into Cancer tomorrow, everything shifts toward emotional security, comfort, the home space, what actually nourishes you. Cancer is where the moon is at home. Literally, it rules Cancer. So the moon moving from Gemini to Cancer is a movement from the mental, social, communicative realm into the feeling, protective, nourishing realm. From processing out loud to knowing quietly from the inside. And that transition, from Mercury stationing retrograde tonight to the moon entering Cancer tomorrow, is actually a beautiful setup for what this retrograde is going to do over the next 3.5 weeks. It's moving you from trying to understand things intellectually into feeling your way through them, which, in Pisces, is exactly what the retrograde needs you to do anyway. So tonight, rather than trying to figure out what Mercury retrograde means for your situation, rather than making lists or having that clarifying conversation, the energy actually supports just letting things be unclear for a bit, sitting in the void, literally and astrologically. Not because nothing matters, but because some things reveal themselves through stillness in a way they never could through activity. Let me talk about who's sitting in the center of this retrograde's energy, because not everyone experiences Mercury retrograde in Pisces the same way. Some of you feel it as a general fogginess. Others feel it like a direct beam of something you need to pay attention to. The degree of impact depends on where Pisces falls in your chart and whether you have personal planets in the signs being activated right now. Pisces, this is your Mercury retrograde in the most literal sense. Mercury is moving backward through your first house, through your sense of self, your face, the way you present yourself to the world. Over the next few weeks, you may find yourself reassessing how you've been communicating who you actually are. Whether the version of yourself you've been putting forward in your life, in your relationships, at work, with people you've just met, matches the version of yourself that feels true when you're alone and quiet. Mercury retrograde in the first house has a particular gift for revealing the gap between those two things. Not as a condemnation, as an invitation. The closer you get to being the same person in both places, the clearer everything becomes. And this retrograde has real potential to help you close that gap if you're willing to sit with what it surfaces. Virgo, you're the other end of the Mercury axis. Pisces is your opposite sign, which means this retrograde is moving through your 7th house, the house of relationships, significant partnerships, the people you make agreements with. Watch for things needing to be revisited in your closest relationships. Conversations that happened in early to mid-February, back when Mercury entered Pisces, may need another pass. Something you thought was settled might need more discussion. Something that felt understood might reveal it wasn't fully understood on both sides. This is not necessarily a problem. It might just be that a more complete conversation was always needed, and Mercury is creating the conditions for it to finally happen. Virgo can get anxious during Mercury retrograde because Virgo trusts its own precision, and precision feels less available right now. The thing to remember is that not everything needs to be resolved immediately. Some things aren't just asking to be held in more consideration. Gemini, Mercury rules your sign, so every Mercury retrograde affects you with an extra degree of personal relevance. This retrograde runs through your 10th house, which is career, public reputation, the longer-term professional path. Something about your direction, a project, a role, a professional relationship or goal is going to benefit from being looked at again. This is not the time to launch. It is absolutely the time to refine, to go back to something you were working on and see it differently than you did a month ago. Gemini's instinct is to keep moving, to generate new material, to pivot when the current thing isn't working. Mercury retrograde in your 10th is asking you to resist that instinct specifically. Stay with what you have, look at it harder. The refinement available here is actually more valuable than the new start would be. Sagittarius, the retrograde is moving through your 4th house of home and emotional foundations. This can stir up things related to your living situation, your relationship with family, the history you carry, the private emotional interior that doesn't always get as much attention as your outer life. Something may surface about where you're rooted, or where you want to be rooted, that you've been moving too fast to really examine. Sagittarius moves. That's the sign. But this retrograde is asking you to pause the movement for a few weeks and sit with something at home, whether that's a literal home question or a more internal sense of what home means to you right now. The answer isn't obvious. Let it develop. For everyone else, let me run through the remaining signs quickly because the house placement matters more than people usually give it credit for during a Mercury retrograde. Aries, this retrograde is in your 12th house. The 12th is the most interior place in the chart, the part of you that exists below the surface of your daily presentation. Mercury retrograde here tends to be unusually internal, even private. Thoughts loop without necessarily needing to be expressed. Dreams carry more information than usual. There can be something genuinely productive in this placement if you don't force yourself to be more outwardly communicative than the energy supports. The 12th house Mercury retrograde rewards stillness and honest self-reflection. What you're meant to understand here you won't find by talking it through with someone. You'll find it by getting quiet enough to hear yourself. Taurus, the retrograde moves through your 11th house of community, friendships, and longer-term visions. Something about a group, a community you're part of, or a vision you've been developing alongside others may need to be revisited. This isn't necessarily complicated. It might be as simple as a conversation within a group that got muffled the first time and needs a second pass, or a collaborative goal that looked one way a month ago and looks a little different now that February has happened. Taurus tends to be steady in its commitments, which is a strength here. But it's also worth double-checking that what you committed to at the start of the month still matches what you actually want. Leo, Mercury retrograde is moving through your 8th house. The 8th is territory most people don't willingly spend time in. It deals with depth, with shared resources, with the dynamics of what's owed and what's held in common, and with the more hidden layers of intimacy. Mercury retrograde here can surface conversations about finances that felt too complicated to have earlier. It can also bring up the emotional depth of a close relationship, the stuff that sits beneath the daily interaction. This placement specifically supports getting honest privately about something you've been carrying in a relationship or a financial situation that hasn't been fully named out loud. You don't have to say it to the other person yet, but saying it to yourself is the first step. Libra, this retrograde is in your 6th house of daily routines, health and work processes. The 6th house is practical territory, and Mercury retrograde here is excellent for going back and fixing something that wasn't working well in your day-to-day systems. A work process that felt inefficient, a health habit that started and then stalled, a routine that you set up with good intentions but that hasn't been holding. This retrograde gives you the energy to revisit and refine those things rather than abandon them and start fresh. Libra sometimes would rather design a new system than fix an existing one. Mercury retrograde in the 6th is specifically asking you to resist that. The existing system just needs adjustment, not replacement. Scorpio, this retrograde moves through your 5th house of creativity, self-expression, play, and romance. Scorpio in the 5th house, Mercury retrograde is actually one of the most creatively productive placements of any retrograde, because the 5th house is where you make things that didn't exist before, and Mercury retrograde in Pisces adds emotional depth and intuitive access to that creative process. If you've been wanting to return to a creative project that fell away, this is a genuinely good period for that. If there's a romantic situation that needs a second conversation or a clearer understanding, this retrograde supports that too. The creative work available here is the kind that surprises you with what it knows. Let it go somewhere unexpected. Capricorn, the retrograde is in your 3rd house of communication, everyday exchange, local environment, and siblings or close relatives. Mercury retrograde in the 3rd house is one of the most classically retrograde-feeling placements because it's in Mercury's own territory. Communications get crossed. Things you thought you said clearly turn out to have been heard differently. Messages arrive late or get interpreted in ways you didn't intend. That's real and worth being careful about. But the gift here is that the 3rd house Mercury retrograde also gives you a chance to have the conversations you've been putting off with people in your immediate circle. The thing you've needed to say to a sibling, a neighbor, a close colleague. The small clearing of the air that would improve a daily situation significantly. This is the time for that, done with care and precision. Aquarius, this retrograde runs through your 2nd house of money, possessions, and what you value. Mercury retrograde in the 2nd house tends to surface financial questions that felt settled, but apparently aren't. This doesn't have to mean bad news. It might mean a purchase that deserves more consideration before it's made, or a financial arrangement that needs to be looked at again with clearer eyes. More broadly, the 2nd house is also about your values, the things you actually prioritize in practice rather than in theory. Mercury retrograde here can be surprisingly clarifying about the gap between those two things. What you say you value and what you consistently choose when you see them side by side can tell you a lot about where the real work is. Look at where Pisces falls in your chart for the most personal read on where this retrograde is doing its work. That's your territory for the next 3.5 weeks, and knowing what house it is gives you a specific lens for what Mercury is trying to surface. There's a frame I find useful for any Mercury retrograde, and especially this one. Mercury retrograde isn't a punishment, and it isn't chaos for chaos's sake. It's a review period. Mercury, as the messenger, as the planet of how your mind works and how information moves through your life, is essentially going back to check on things, to see what was missed, what got garbled, what needs to be understood more fully before the next forward motion can be clean. And in Pisces, what Mercury is going back to check on are the emotional undercurrents that rational communication always moves a little too fast to fully register. Pisces is the sign of the sea, and Mercury in Pisces retrograde is essentially diving under the surface of your thinking to look at what's living down there. The feelings you rationalized away, the intuitions you dismissed because you didn't have evidence for them. The thing you knew without knowing why you knew it. There's something that happens early in this retrograde on February 28th, just 3 days from now, that I want to mention because it sets the tone for the whole period. Mercury retrograde makes its first major aspect, a conjunction with Venus, also in Pisces. Venus at this point is still exalted, still in its open-hearted mode, still carrying some of the warmth from the trine with Jupiter we had a few days ago. And Mercury, newly retrograde, backs into Venus. That conjunction is significant because it means the first thing Mercury does in its retrograde journey is link up with the planet of love and beauty and what you value, which suggests that the most personally meaningful material this retrograde surfaces will be relational, tied to what you love, what you want, what you feel about your closest connections. Not in a dramatic way necessarily, but in that quiet Piscean way where something just becomes clearer. You understand something about someone or about yourself in relation to someone that you were in the process of understanding but hadn't fully arrived at yet. And then, on March 7th, there's the Cazimi. That's the moment when Mercury and the Sun are exactly conjunct. 16 degrees of Pisces, the midpoint of this retrograde. In traditional astrology, Cazimi means the planet is in the heart of the Sun, at its most purified, its most essential, its most powerful, even in apparent weakness. Cazimi moments during retrogrades are famous for bringing unexpected clarity, for producing the one clear signal in the middle of the fog. So if the early days of this retrograde feel murky, if things feel more confusing than clarifying, hold out for March 7th. Something specific tends to land then that makes sense of the whole period. The retrograde wraps on March 20th, which is also the spring equinox. That timing is not subtle. The day the northern hemisphere tips into spring is the same day Mercury starts moving forward again in Pisces. New season, returning momentum. The shadow period runs through April 9th, which is when Mercury finally exits the degrees it covered during the retrograde, and the full energetic cycle closes. So the arc here is review and retrieve, February 25th through March 7th. Clarity moment around the Cazimi on March 7th. Integration and wrap-up March 7th through March 20th. Then spring and forward. When you step back from today specifically and look at the week as a whole, something comes into focus. February 2026 has been an unusual month, and not unusual in a way that's been easy to move through. The Saturn-Neptune conjunction on the 20th was a genuinely once-in-a-generation event. Two planets that deal in completely different things: structure and dissolution, reality and fantasy, limitation and the infinite, sitting right on top of each other at the very first degree of Aries, the beginning of the zodiac. That conjunction was a reset, and it asked some uncomfortable questions about what you've been building your life around and whether those foundations are as solid as you thought. Then Venus and Jupiter offered some warmth midweek, a reminder that even in the middle of genuine structural questions, there's real abundance and real connection available if you're paying attention to it. A day where things that had felt hard felt easier, where love was a little closer to the surface than usual. Then the first quarter moon and Mercury's final hours of direct motion, a decision point energy that pressed on everything the eclipse opened up on February 17th. And then tonight, Mercury actually stops. What the week is asking you to do, and what this retrograde now extends for another 3.5 weeks, is to integrate rather than rush. The Saturn-Neptune conjunction brought questions. Mercury retrograde in Pisces is the period in which you actually sit with those questions, long enough to let real answers emerge. Not the quick intellectual ones, not the answers that are really just the familiar story rearranged, but the answers that come from actually feeling your way through something. That's not a comfortable process for most people. We're trained to move forward, to solve, to resolve, to get to the next thing. Mercury retrograde in Pisces specifically interrupts that training. It creates conditions where the usual forward momentum isn't available, and the thing that replaces it is this slower, more internal, more emotional kind of knowing. The irony, and this is the thing that makes this retrograde's timing strange and actually beautiful, is that the confusion Mercury retrograde in Pisces tends to create is often the thing that breaks you open enough to receive something real. You can't figure your way through fog, but you can feel your way through it. And what you find on the other side of this retrograde, around March 20th, when Mercury stations direct on the same day spring begins, tends to be a version of yourself that knows more quietly and more accurately than the version that was moving fast enough to miss all of this. The week that just happened in the sky is one of the more significant weeks of the entire year, and this retrograde is its continuation. It's not a detour from the transformation this month set in motion. It's the part where the transformation becomes understood. If this has been useful, leave a like and subscribe and drop water here in the comments. I'll be covering the Cazimi on March 7th, because that's the inflection point of this whole retrograde, and you'll want to be there for it. Alright, take care of yourself through this one. It's asking for gentleness, and you can give it that. I'll see you in the next one. Okay, so I pulled up your chart, and the first thing that jumped out at me before I even looked at anything else was your 7th house. Because you have 4 planets in there. The Sun, Venus, Uranus, and Pluto, all sitting in Virgo, all in the house of partnership. And that tells me something really specific about you. Relationships are not a side chapter in your life. They are where you figure out who you are. The people you choose, the partnerships you build, those are the crucible for everything. Your identity forms in relation to others in a way that is more true for you than for most people. Venus in Virgo in the 7th means you love through detail, through showing up, through noticing the specific thing someone needs before they ask for it. That's not a cold way to love, even though people sometimes read Virgo as cold. It's actually one of the most devoted ways to love. You're just not doing grand declarations. You're doing the thing that actually helps. You have Saturn conjuncture Aquarius rising, and I want to talk about what that's like from the inside, rather than just what it looks like from outside. Because from outside, people see someone composed, someone who clearly has it together, and they respond to that with a kind of automatic respect. They take you seriously. They assume you know what you're doing. And I imagine that expectation has sometimes felt like a weight, because the composed exterior becomes the expectation, and then you have to keep meeting it even on the days when you're not feeling composed at all. Your Capricorn moon in the 11th reinforces this. Emotionally, you're private. You feel things deeply, but you keep it structured. You're most alive when you're working towards something meaningful, when you're contributing to something bigger than yourself. But the part of you that just wants to be cared for without having to be useful first, that part tends to stay very quiet. Here's what I'd say directly to you. You probably undercharge. And I say that with real care, not as a criticism. Not just financially, though maybe that too, but in the broader sense. You accept less than what your actual contribution warrants, because somewhere underneath all that competence there's a pattern of keeping your own expectations managed. And 2026 is specifically working on that. Which brings me to the transits. Saturn and Neptune conjoined at 0 degrees Aries on February 20th, which for your chart lands right in your 2nd house, the house of self-worth and what you believe you deserve. That transit is asking you a direct question. Where has your sense of your own value been built on a story that wasn't fully accurate? Neptune is dissolving the old version of that story. Saturn is asking you to build something more honest in its place. That's not a comfortable process. But it's an important one, and it has staying power. What you figure out about your own worth this year is not temporary. It becomes the foundation for the next several years. And later in April, Uranus moves into Gemini, which for your chart activates the 4th and 5th house zone. Your home, your roots, your creative life, things that have felt fixed in those areas are about to become more fluid. And for you specifically, that is a good thing. It is liberation more than disruption. Your North Node is in Cancer in the 5th house, and I want to end on this because I think it is the most important thing in the whole chart. And for someone with a Capricorn moon, that is a really specific tension. Your emotional default is Capricorn. Structured, productive, disciplined. And your soul's direction is Cancer, which is almost the opposite. Soft, present. Willing to let the feeling matter more than the function. The 5th house is play. It is the house of creative expression, of genuine pleasure, of the kind of aliveness that does not need to justify itself with productivity. It's creative expression for its own sake, not because it produces something useful, just because it's alive. And your chart is genuinely asking you to let that in, not to give up the structure. That's part of who you are, and it serves you. But to stop treating joy as something you earn after the work is done. The Cancer North Node in the 5th house is telling you that for you, the joy is part of the work now. Chiron in Pisces in your 1st house tells me that the wound underneath all of this is around belonging, around feeling slightly outside of things, even when you are right in the middle of them. And Chiron in the 1st house means you're healing, and the gift you carry for others runs directly through that experience. The way you have learned to find your own footing when the external compass did not point somewhere true, that is actually what makes you genuinely useful to people around you. Not despite that feeling, but because of it. If this resonated, let me know in the comments. And for everyone else who submitted their details, more readings are coming. Leave a like and subscribe if you want to see them.